There is a fund. It has a name. It has a 15-year timeline. It has a stated purpose. Investing in the communities surrounding one of the most significant infrastructure projects in Canadian history. And according to the official government announcement released on July 10th, it is financed by a portion of profits from bridge operations. Those are the words: portion of profits, 15 years, regional economic development, announced by the Canadian government, embraced by the American administration, spread across social media as proof that Ottawa had finally won something real and significant from a trading partner that had spent 18 months resisting every Canadian interest. The problem is the three words buried inside that announcement that nobody in Ottawa spent any time examining: portion of profits. Because the moment you start asking what profits actually means in the context of a $6.44 billion bridge that Canada paid for entirely by itself, the entire celebration begins to fall apart into a set of numbers that nobody on the Canadian side of the story has released for public review. Numbers that Windsor's own mayor described this week as likely to be very little, if any, during the first 15 years of the bridge's operational life. That is the story of the 15-year profit fund. Not a story about what it promises, but a story about what it actually contains. And once you follow that story from the July 10th announcement all the way back through the financial structure that was designed in 2012 and has never been changed, despite everything that happened in between, the picture that emerges looks nothing like the victory that was announced on Parliament Hill on Friday morning, and nothing like the celebration that followed it. Let's start with the announcement itself, because the specific language of that document is doing a huge amount of work that most coverage has not examined closely enough. On July 10th, Canada's Housing and Infrastructure Department released a joint statement confirming that the Gordie Howe International Bridge would open on July 27th. The statement described a series of cooperative measures focused on toll governance and transparency. It committed the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority to work together with the United States government on toll rate changes, specifically seeking approval for certain toll changes that aren't based on market conditions. And then came the sentence that produced the celebration. Canada and the United States had agreed to set up a 15-year economic development fund tied to a portion of profits from bridge operations. A separate Canadian government source briefing reporters from CBC News and BNN Bloomberg after that announcement added the specific detail that explained what portion actually meant in numbers. Canada would keep 50% of the bridge's toll profits in the first 15 years. The other 50% would go into the Economic Development Fund, which the source confirmed would be directed toward American communities and investment on the U.S. side of the border. The fund's administrator, the source noted, had not yet been decided. The American response came the following morning and was clear. They called it a great and fair deal. American politicians went on radio and said America had gone from getting nothing to getting significant money. The celebration was complete, public, and immediate. Then, Windsor Mayor Drew Dilkens, whose city sits on the Canadian side of the river and whose residents helped build this bridge through years of construction, gave a radio interview that contained a sentence the Canadian press barely noticed. "The money coming to America," Dilkens said, "is tied strictly to net profits, and there will be very little, if any, actual profit left to divide during the first 15 years of the bridge's lifespan. Very little, if any." From the mayor of the Canadian city right next to the bridge on the day after the celebration in Washington. That's the 15-year profit fund fully described. Not a stream of significant revenue, possibly nothing at all for a very long time. To understand why the mayor said that, you have to understand the financial structure that has governed this project since the original Canada-Michigan Crossing Agreement was signed in 2012. That agreement is a public document. It has been publicly available for 14 years. It has not been changed, replaced, or updated. By the July 10th announcement, it remains the main financial framework that everything else is built on. And what it says in plain language is this: toll revenues collected from bridge users will first be used to pay back Canada for the money it put forward for construction. Once the costs are fully paid back, toll revenue will be shared with the state of Michigan. Canada first. Costs recovered, then sharing begins. That was the original deal. That was the arrangement that existed before February 8th of this year. That was the structure America said wasn't good enough and demanded be replaced with something better. And here is the critical detail about that structure that has been missing from almost every piece of Canadian coverage of this story. According to the Canadian government source who briefed reporters after the July 10th announcement and confirmed by independent financial analysis published this week by Downstream News Media, the original agreement projected it would take at least 50 years before Canada got back its $6.4 billion investment. At least 50 years. That was the baseline before the 15-year fund was ever discussed. Now, let's do the basic math that the celebration posts and the radio appearances and the victory announcements all carefully avoided doing publicly. The Gordie Howe Bridge costs 6.4 billion Canadian dollars to build. Canada paid all of it, not 50%, not some portion split based on ownership, every dollar. The bridge's expected daily traffic volume at opening is projected to capture a significant share of the roughly 40,000 vehicles that currently cross the Windsor-Detroit corridor every day through the existing Ambassador Bridge. Let's use a careful estimate and say the Gordie Howe captures 25,000 vehicles per day at first, growing as trucking companies move from the older crossing. The tolls were set by the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority in March of this year, specifically designed to compete with the Ambassador Bridge at roughly half those rates. Annual gross toll revenue at those volumes would run into the hundreds of millions of dollars on a good year. That sounds substantial until you subtract what comes before any profit calculation even starts. Annual operating costs for a cable-stayed bridge of this size: 6 lanes, automated tolling systems, customs facilities on both sides of the international border, lighting, maintenance, and security run in the tens of millions of dollars annually at minimum. Industry standards for similar infrastructure suggest operating spending of between $30 and $60 million per year before any financing costs are counted. Then comes the debt service. $6.44 billion borrowed at the interest rates available to the Canadian government in the years when construction was happening generates annual costs in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Depending on how long the loan runs and what interest rate applies to the specific loans used to finance the project, those financing costs must be paid before any calculation of net profit can begin. Then, the principal repayment schedule, whatever structure was set up in the original 2012 financing deal, generates its own annual cash requirement on top of the interest burden. Add operating costs, maintenance, interest, and principal repayment together, and the sum that must be covered before any net profit exists to be divided is in all realistic situations larger than the gross toll revenue the bridge will generate in its early years of operation, when traffic is still growing toward its full volumes. The bridge is not expected to be running at full commercial capacity the moment it opens. Traffic grows over time as businesses adjust their shipping routes, as new contracts are signed by logistics companies, as truckers become familiar with the new crossing option. During those early years, which typically last across the first 3 to 5 years of a major new crossings operation, the gap between operating costs plus financing obligations and actual revenue collected will be the largest it will ever be. This is why Windsor Mayor Dilkins said very little, if any. Not because he was making a political argument, not because he was trying to downplay what Canada had given away, but because he was reading the same financial structure that has governed this project since 2012, and using basic math to figure out what the 15-year profit fund actually contains when you account for everything that comes before net profit is calculated. Downstream news media, in an analysis published this week that talked to infrastructure finance experts familiar with the project's original financial plan, reached the same conclusion using specific numbers. While American politicians can claim they secured half the profits of the project, the publication noted the actual money going into the U.S. Regional Fund is expected to be minimal while truck traffic grows. The regulatory changes, meaning the toll governance adjustments, and the U.S. control over rate changes, carry more practical weight for bridge operators than the revenue split does for the American Treasury. That last sentence is worth stopping on because it points to something in this deal that has received even less attention than the net profit question, and that matters far more for how the bridge will work as public infrastructure over the long term. The July 10th announcement included a commitment by the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority to work together with the United States government on toll rate changes, seeking approval for certain toll changes that aren't based on market conditions. In the briefings that followed, this was spelled out more clearly. Canada cannot raise tolls by more than 10% above current rates without U.S. federal government approval. Canada cannot lower toll rates below the regional average, meaning below what the Ambassador Bridge charges, without U.S. agreement. These limits apply to a bridge that Canada built, owns half of in partnership with Michigan, and operates through a Canadian Crown corporation. They give a government that contributed nothing to the construction of this asset a formal say over the pricing decisions of the entity managing it. The Ambassador Bridge, which the new Gordie Howe crossing cannot price below without U.S. approval, is owned by the Maroon family. Matthew Maroon donated $1 million to an American political group aligned with Trump approximately 1 month before the February 8th announcement that threatened to block the bridge's opening. The Globe and Mail reported in early July that Maroon was simultaneously talking with American Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra specifically to arrange a deal that would ensure the Ambassador Bridge wouldn't lose all of its toll revenue to the Gordie Howe. The U.S. denied on July 4th that the delay had anything to do with the Maroons. An American congressional committee opened a formal investigation into the connection between the donation, the meeting, and the policy result. What the July 10th deal ultimately produced in its toll governance provisions is a pricing floor below which the Gordie Howe cannot compete. Set at roughly the level where the Ambassador Bridge currently sits, the new publicly owned crossing, built specifically to offer a competitive choice to the century-old privately owned crossing, is now limited by a U.S. government control from pricing low enough to speed up traffic movement away from that private crossing. For the Maroon family, that limit is arguably more valuable than any specific dollar amount flowing through the 15-year Economic Development Fund. It is a structural protection against the commercial decline that the Gordie Howe Bridge was designed to cause. Former Windsor West MP Brian Mass, who followed the bridge's development for years and gave an interview to CTV News this week, specifically addressing the deal, was direct in his assessment. The toll governance concession, he said, represents a significant ongoing limit on how the Bridge Authority can manage the crossing in Canada's interests. The revenue split is the headline, The toll control is the fine print. And in infrastructure management, the fine print is usually what matters most over time. Conservative MP Choi, Madame Dar, sent a formal letter to Canada's Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Dominic LeBlanc this week, demanding that the full text of the agreement, including a complete financial accounting of projected costs, revenues, and the expected value of the 15-year fund, be made public before the bridge opens. On July 27th, no overall figure, Madame Dar noted, had been released. No payment schedule, no projection of what 50% of net profit from the first 15 years actually equals in dollar terms. His request was specific and entirely reasonable. Show Canadians what 50% of net actually means in numbers before the bridge opens, not after. LeBlanc had not responded publicly by the time this piece was written. The fund's administrator, as the official announcement confirmed, has not yet been determined. The full text of the agreement has not been released. The mathematical projection of what flows into the fund over 15 years, the number that would allow any observer to evaluate whether the claimed benefits are supported by actual evidence, remains unavailable to the public. What is available is the original 2012 agreement, the July 10th announcement, the financial analysis published by Downstream News this week, Windsor Mayor Dilkins's radio interview, Canada's Prime Minister's statements, and the basic math of a $6.44 billion debt service obligation that must be covered before any net profit calculation begins. Taken together, those sources produce a consistent picture. The 15-year Economic Development Fund is real. It exists. It will receive 50% of whatever net profit the bridge generates during its first 15 years of operation. The question is what net profit amounts to on a bridge carrying a construction debt that was originally projected to take at least 50 years to repay through toll revenue alone. And the answer, drawn from the mayor of the host city, from independent infrastructure finance analysis, from Canada's own Prime Minister, and from the basic mathematics of the 2012 agreement that still governs the project's financial structure, is the same everywhere you look. Very little, if any. Possibly nothing at all, depending on how quickly traffic volumes grow, how operating costs are managed, and what the annual debt service obligations consume before the net calculation is even reached. America claimed they got a great deal. The 15-year profit fund exists on paper, funded by a mathematical leftover that the people who actually understand this project's finances describe as likely to be minimal or absent during the exact period it covers. The toll governance provisions that limit the bridge authority's ability to price aggressively enough to draw commercial traffic away from a competing crossing. A crossing whose owner donated to an American political group and lobbied American commerce officials during the delay, may ultimately prove more important than the revenue split in determining how this bridge operates for decades. The bridge opens July 27th, 6 lanes, cable-stayed, connecting Interstate 75 to Highway 41, the first freeway-to-freeway international crossing this region has ever had. $126 billion in annual commercial goods currently move through this corridor. The bridge will handle a growing share of that freight more efficiently than the century-old crossing upstream can manage. The communities on both sides, in southwest Detroit's Delray neighborhood and in Windsor's East End, will see real economic activity that has nothing to do with the political theater that delayed the opening by more than a month. But the fund at the center of the celebration, the 15-year profit fund that America announced and broadcast and used as proof that they had won something significant from Canada, is funded by a number that hasn't been disclosed. It's based on a calculation that starts only after $6.4 billion in construction debt has been paid for. and the people closest to the project describe it as likely to contain very little, if any, actual money during the years it covers. That is, the 15-year Economic Development Fund, fully described, not by critics or political opponents, but by the math of the 2012 agreement, the words of Canada's Prime Minister, and the assessment of the mayor of the city that built it. The celebration in Washington was real.